Thank you all for coming. Andrew Cockburn, as you may or may not know, is part of the Cockburn dynasty. His father Claude, a very famous British journalist who exposed many of the fascist crimes in Spain, and his three sons, Alexander, Andrew, and Patrick, have gone on in that great family tradition of exposing crimes around the world, mainly those committed by those in power over all of our lives. With that in mind, one of the great criminals is the subject of this biography, Rumsfeld, An American Disaster. It is not a book that is afraid to take sides. It does not pretend to be a fair, objective, reasonable analysis of an interesting bureaucratic career. It is the story of a man that Andrew calls one of the great courtiers of history. He somehow, Rumsfeld has managed to place himself at the nexus of power again and again and again, whether a corporate power or a government power. And at almost every stage of a long career, he's managed to do as much harm to the public and to the body politic as is possible to do. We've seen the worst of it in Iraq, where perhaps as many as 750,000 people have died as a result of his policies. But it goes back a long way. I'm particularly touched by, or particularly interested that he was one of those who worked with Paul Nitze to bring the MX missile program on stream in America. He was also responsible for bringing NutraSweet and aspartame to the American market. Thus, all of those of you who don't use sugar in your coffee but use those artificial sweeteners are going to get brain tumors. Again and again and again, when you look for the reason or the person for so many of the terrible things that have happened in America and in America's empire, it seems to come back to Donald Rumsfeld. And it's not because he's such an interesting character, such an interesting personality. Actually, he seems rather dull. But it's because of what he's done. He's a bit like Ariel Sharon in Israel, whose career goes back to the founding of the state and will be remembered as a man who built walls and put people in cemeteries, and at every stage of Israel's history. Now, in this book, which I would strongly urge you all to buy and to read, I'm also not very objective and fair about this either. I admire this book very much. I admire Andrew very much. He's a friend. I'm the godfather of his son. And if you're expecting a confrontation, it'll have to come from you, not from me, because I don't want to face my godson if I say anything bad about his father. I've just finished reading the book now in the bar. I've been reading it all day. I'm reminded, I was happy to read it all day. It was a very good way to spend the day. I'm reminded, at this moment, there's a policy of the U.S. government to destabilize Lebanon and Iran. And there are illegal funds going to Lebanese parties and to dissidents in Iran to perform terrorist acts. And that the nexus of this are two veterans of the Iran-Contra affair, Elliot Abrams and Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia. And although Abrams was convicted as a result of the Iran-Contra affair, he came back. And Rumsfeld is someone else who, no matter how many times he disgraced himself, came back again and again and again. And I want to ask Andrew, because his book ends with Rumsfeld's dismissal as Secretary of Defense, if he could come back again.
Well, my immediate answer would be no. How could he? I mean, he's been the author of this colossal disaster, not just the laying waste of an entire country and a very substantial contribution to the death of 750,000 people, but also, even more importantly, in the views of the Republican Party, he probably cost them the election last November. That being said, as you said, he does come back. He cost the Republicans probably the presidential election in 1976. So he's a man who, rides on the shoulder of disaster, the disasters he inflicts on other people. He likes to, at the moment I have it on reasonable authority that he's actually working on a book which will show how successful he was and what a masterful manager he was, and how if anything went wrong, it was somebody else's fault, which is very much his MO, as you'll see if you look at the book, that throughout his career, and certainly in the last few years, he was anything that went wrong was somebody else's fault, right down to his very last trip to Iraq, when he'd like to have these sort of Mussolini-style rallies with the troops, town meetings he called them, and one soldier said, one soldier actually had the courage to ask him, said, why were you so impatient to go to war? Why didn't you wait to see what the final result of the inspections was of the WMD? And even at that stage, he had to say, you're talking to the wrong guy. It wasn't my decision. You have to talk to the president, talk to the Congress. So he's, it's a full true measure of his character. He likes to say how old he is. He's actually not that old. He's only 74. But whenever, especially when he's under attack, he'd say, oh, you're talking to an old man. He's, again, ducking things. All things are possible. He's got a huge amount of money. And unfortunately, there's a sort of spirit of forgiveness in America. Never forget that Richard Nixon came back. So among the many grim specters that dance before our eyes is the possibility, hopefully faint, that Donald Rumsfeld, that we've not heard the last of Donald Rumsfeld.
I didn't realize until I read the book how serious his presidential ambitions were throughout most of his life.
Donald Rumsfeld, from about the age of 18, or maybe even earlier, has been totally convinced there is no person better suited in those United States to be president than him. And he's always made that clear. He's always been utterly convinced that he's the best man to be president. And he was always, until the late 1980s, he was convinced that the people wanted him. As soon as he sort of put other things in order and made a substantial pot of money, he would then run for office and he would be elected. He was absolutely assured of this. So when he finally did run for the 1988 election, it came as sort of surprise to him that he peaked in the polls at 2%. That didn't last for long. There was a little blip, then he went back to 1%. And he blamed it, characteristically, on the political system, not him. He said, you can run, I discovered you can run for president or you can raise money, but not both, and I was running for president. I mean, it's like it's kind of a ludicrous remark. But that was his explanation to himself that that you had to engage in this grubby business of asking people to give you money, and if you didn't do that, then you couldn't be elected. You couldn't run for president. Whereas he wanted to discuss serious issues. He was the Pericles, the statesman of this affair. In fact, no one would give him money because no one liked him. That was the simple fact of the matter.
But he emerges in this book as also someone who doesn't like a lot of people himself. He bears grudges. I didn't realize until I read the book the genesis of the animosity between him and Dick Cheney, whereas it's always assumed by people that he and Cheney are very much together. In fact, there is a lot of history of animosity. Maybe you could tell us where that began.
Well, that's right. I mean, they originally, Dick Cheney was Rumsfeld's flunky. He was considered, around Washington in the early 70s, that's Dick Cheney, he's Rumsfeld's flunky. He was, Rumsfeld had hired him, given him practically his first job. Someone else in politics at the time, someone who worked in the White House, said, Dick Cheney has devoted his adult life to the study of political science and the service of Donald Rumsfeld. And so Rumsfeld brought him along to be his assistant in the Nixon administration, and then found him a job when Rumsfeld went overseas, and came back, made him the deputy White House chief of staff, and then sort of conferred on him the position of chief of staff when he went off to run the Pentagon. So then, now in 1986, Rumsfeld decides now is the time, as I just said, he's going to give himself to the people and be elected president. So he calls on Cheney. He says, right, I'm about to announce my campaign, and I want you, drop whatever you're doing, and I want you by my side. And Cheney, to Rumsfeld's shock and horror and outrage, said, no, I'm doing other things now. I've moved on politically. What was really going on was Cheney was planning his own presidential campaign, which is kind of a horrifying thought. But and he was and he had been making his way up the ladder of the Congressional Republican Party. And Rumsfeld, they had this. I mean, I've got a very good authority. Rumsfeld said to him on the phone, said, "All that you are, I made you. What do you mean? How dare you?" And when Cheney still said, "I'll do anything else for you, but not this, Don." So Rumsfeld went into a characteristic snit, and refused to speak to Cheney for quite a few years. When Cheney became Secretary of Defense in Bush Senior administration, they have these sort of ceremonies they like to do, which is the gathering of, they call them of the formers, and the sort of very geriatric senior war criminals are trundled out, like Robert McNamara and James Schlesinger, and they to confer their blessings on the current incumbent. But Rumsfeld always refused to go to Cheney's once, stayed away. So that it's not that they were still bitter enemies. When Rumsfeld became Secretary of Defense was appointed this time around, everyone assumed, his old buddy Cheney, of course, gave him that job. But they weren't sort of that close at that point. Cheney, they'd had someone else in mind, a former Republican senator called Coates, who they thought would keep them in, they needed to hold on to the Republican right, and he was a religious fanatic like Bush, and so he was fine. But at his job interview with Bush, he blew it by confessing a lack of faith in missile defense, which was like a sort of religious creed for these people. So they had dropped him and had to find someone else in a hurry, so they said, okay, we'll go with Rumsfeld. But they was quite dispassionate about it. And in this administration, Cheney, as my understanding is that Cheney and Rumsfeld, they worked together, and they were the two pillars of this administration, two sort of ghastly props, and they would back each other up, but they fulfilled different functions in it.
Speaking of missiles, if you could tell the story, because I think it's very interesting and rather illustrative, the Team B over the ABM treaty and over whether the Soviets did or did not have anti-ballistic missiles, what happened and how evidence was used and what that told us about how evidence might be used in Iraq later.
Right. Well, a recurrent theme of Rumsfeld, the War Party, and the neoconservative, the War Party, in the States has been that the CIA, they're always complaining that the CIA is not militant enough. The CIA is covering somehow a bizarre sort of notion, but that the CIA was somehow concealing evidence of Soviet perfidy, for whatever reason we don't know. And so there was always the call that if only we had the real facts, if only the intelligence was good enough, the people would realize that we absolutely need a missile defense system now, because they'd realize how far the Soviets are ahead of us and how much more we need to spend on defense. And the mastermind, I talk a lot about in the book, the sort of mastermind of a lot of this was a rather sinister character called Paul Nitzer, who right from 1950, he spent so many years trying to blow us all up. He was a sort of backroom intriguer in Washington, very wealthy, sort of went in and out of administrations, but always was working to heighten tensions with the Soviet Union and thus increase the defense budget. And in the mid-70s, he fostered the idea, this recurring theme of the perfidious CIA, and he said we need a Team B, second team, to reassess the intelligence that will then reveal to all how ghastly the threat is and what measures we have to take. And Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense, who was very much sort of influenced by Nitzer, joined the push for this. They got Ford to agree to it. And they recruited various characters, including a callow young defense intellectual of no marked ability called Paul Wolfowitz, who set to work. And they came up with this. They moved into the CIA. They came up with this sort of mad construction of how the Soviets had developed death rays and how the Soviets had thousands of bombers that were many hundreds of intercontinental bombers that were going to, lay waste to the United States immediately. And in fact, their methodology, you can see, they did exactly the same thing again in the few years before the Iraq War. It was the same, almost the same rhetoric. The CIA is concealing the evidence. The CIA is not. I want to speak for the CIA here, but that was the same line of attack. And only if we can set up a team of disinterested analysts, then the perfidy of the Soviet Union / Saddam Hussein will be revealed and the case for war will be clear. So it's, none of us should have been surprised what happened this time because they'd done it before. And actually came very close to destroying the entire globe as opposed to one Middle Eastern country.
there's some funny moments in the book as well. I was particularly amused by the war games, the shadow government, where Rumsfeld was one of those people who might have been in a shadow government had the government been destroyed, and he was called off to do war games, and then his approach to dealing with the situation, which I think also tells us a lot about his character, which borders on at least unstable.
Well, that's right. I would say after the end of his abortive presidential campaign, Rumsfeld found another way to be president, which was to act the part, because they, for many years, the U.S. government was secretly spending $1 billion a year on a program called Continuity of Government, which is what to do when the war starts. The president, the White House disappears in a puff of smoke, but the government must be carried on, and the war must be carried on. So this was a huge boon to various, particularly communications companies, because they spent enormous sums of money, first of all digging sort of secret bunkers around the country, and then very elaborate communication systems, so that they could re-establish control of the U.S. and the military, after the initial Soviet strike. And they'd have periodic exercises quite on a very regular basis, and people would be called in to play the part of chief executive, either the president in a scenario where he'd escaped, the initial Soviet attack, or someone who'd taken who had now stepped into the role. And Rumsfeld was regularly called in to act this part. It's a horrifying notion, and he loved it. There were other people who would do it too.
In a secret location.
In a secret location. They were, people who were taking, other people I've talked to who took part in these things. You'd be summoned and you'd be put in a plane with blacked out windows and flown somewhere you didn't know where, and then in darkness taken into this underground burrow. One person I talked to who took part said that they could tell they were somewhere in the south because the people who were serving them the food spoke with southern accents, but that was about all they knew. But Rumsfeld, other people would do it sometimes, or else say, I'm busy, going fishing or whatever, business meeting. Rumsfeld turned up without fail, and what other people noticed was that whereas in the scenarios, sometimes you were given the option, first of all, what you were meant to be practicing was, first of all, reconstitution, how to sort of get the administrative machinery of the United States working again. And that was the first phase. And then, carrying on, retaliation. That was sort of phase 2, where you hit back at the Russians or the Chinese. Rumsfeld always wanted to go to stage 2 immediately. and even to sort of go on, even if it had been a sort of, even if there'd just been there was one case I heard about where they hadn't even gone to nuclear weapons yet. The scenario faced was, there's been a conventional war has broken out in Europe, and okay, what do we do now? And the position, the sort of putative, the role of Secretary of State was being played by an old State Department diplomat who said, well, maybe we can negotiate this. We don't want to go any further. And Rumsfeld, voice was coming over a speakerphone to the so-called, quote unquote, State Department bunker, saying, no, we must go to full launch now, i.e. blow up Russia and China right away. So there was this bureaucratic battle played out. And the old diplomat was actually quite smart. But he said his role was complicated by the fact that his deputy in the game was someone who in real life figured that Donald Rumsfeld might be useful to him one day. So this guy kept finding himself being betrayed by his deputy. So it shows even in these make-believe situations, deep underground, the sort of real business of Washington, which was bureaucratic backstabbing, carried on. Anyway, the diplomat won, and he managed to ward off World War III, the game. And Roswell was absolutely furious and sort of did his best to sabotage his career or any further appointments for him.
But on September 11th, 2001, he had a real crisis on his hands in the Pentagon when part of the Pentagon was blown up. How did he respond in a real situation?
He goofed off. The morning of September 11th, the first thing that happens, of course, is the trade towers in New York are hit. Well, the first hit. A lot of people reacted and thought, something terrible is going on. Not Don, who carried on with his normal day. I mean, he's carried on his program. Next thing on his normal schedule was to get his CIA briefing. He carried on with his CIA briefing. Someone who did realize that something wrong was up was the Pentagon police officer who was his security guard that day,
who went round, thought, oh, well, something's going on. The country looks like bad things are happening, and went along to was standing outside his office thinking we might have to move him to some whatever bunker they had available. No, I don't know what it was. And so then there's this sort of thump, and there's the sound of the plane hitting the Pentagon. And the officer, he gets a call over the radio. So a few seconds, and then he gets a call. He starts to get some idea what's happened over his radio. And then the door opens, and out pops Rumsfeld, Rumsfeld wouldn't wear his jacket in the office. He'd take off his jacket and wear a sort of fleece-lined sort of waistcoat, because he said it was the air conditioning made him feel cold. And he'd taken off his waistcoat, put on his jacket, and he looked to the officer, and the officer said, "Sir," Officer Davis told me about this, said, "Sir, we've had a report that the planes hit the mall," which is one of the further side around the Pentagon, next one along. So Rumsfeld doesn't say anything, just turns around and marches off. And the security people are frantic, summoning people. The officer calls other people, and they're following Rumsfeld, and then they keep going. It's actually turned out to be even further away, and the building is getting dark, it's filling with smoke. Screaming people are running past. Rumsfeld's marching on, not saying anything. And finally they grope outside, and there's this, all the lights are off now, and they get out, and they see a door half open. They come out, and there's this wall of flame. The building's on fire, and that part of the building is. And Rumsfeld bends down and picks up a bit of the bits of metal from the aircraft lying around. He picks one up and says, "American Airlines." And meanwhile, the radio, the police radio is erupting with, "Where's the secretary? Where's Mr. Roosevelt? What's happened to him?" And the policeman is trying to say, "We got him, he's here," but he couldn't get through. So, the high command of the American military was absent. Then someone says, one of the emergency workers said, "Oh, we need help over here." And there was something they ran over and helped carry a stretcher across the grass. And then it dawned on Rumsfeld that maybe he, had a job to do. So they then make their way back. So he'd been gone for 20 minutes before he got back in the building. Then he went off and met with his closest aides. He met with his FLAC, his PR aide person, and his squash partner and personal chief of staff, a guy called Dorita, and his guy who was his close sort of aide, a rather sinister fellow, Dr. Cambone. And only after another half hour did he actually go along to the military command post to help defend the country. So it was typical Rummy. He didn't do the job he was meant to do. Went and sort of micromanaged the crash. Well, it helped carry a stretcher, which probably wasn't the most useful thing for the Secretary of Defense to be doing. But then, characteristically, carefully cultivated the notion that his first instinct was to go help the wounded. And that he dashed immediately to the crash site. It did him no end of good. It was Rummy. It was particularly fortunate for him that Bush was, listening to My Pet Goat, or, then ran out of town. So the only hero we had around that day was Don, who made a great thing of it, lived off it for years.
But he and Cheney seem to have had a misunderstanding about the chain of command, what the constitutional process is now.
Right. They went straight out the window. Well, there's a thing which is a product of the Cold War. The Constitution says there's the president, then there's the line of succession is the president, the vice president, and so on down the cabinet, Secretary of State, Speaker of the House, so forth. But during the process of all those years of getting ready for World War III, there's a new thing that's arisen called the National Command Authority, which is the president. It's a collective entity of the president and the Secretary of Defense, who are each separately entitled to launch. To press the red button and send the missiles flying. And so Rumsfeld, if the president isn't giving orders, the Secretary of Defense is the one who's in charge of defending the country. He could give orders to shoot down hijacked planes, for example. And so, but while Rumsfeld was off, picking up bits of metal and carrying one stretcher, Cheney was meanwhile in a bunker underneath the White House, and he was busily issuing orders to shoot down planes. As it turned out, they were the wrong planes.
Was a helicopter for medical evacuation?
Yeah, one was a medevac helicopter on its way to the Pentagon, actually. And he tried to shoot down Flight 93. Actually, he gave the order. After Flight 93 had already crashed, So, then the two of them finally sort of talk, and it's clear that we have the transcript of what they said, that none of them had the faintest idea what was going on. Luckily, Cheney likes to talk in this sort of clipped way out of the side of his mouth, but no one. The orders he gave for shooting down planes were so vaguely phrased, because he had no idea how the military really works, that the pilot's commanders just refused to pass the baton. Some people had some sense.
This book is also filled with wonderful gems of quotes, one of which is from an ex-colleague from the Nixon days in the White House called Bill Seidman?
Seidman, yeah.
Bill Seidman, who says, Don Rumsfeld is an extremely talented and capable man who would do an excellent job as vice president. This is when he was thinking he might be running for vice president. Excellent job as vice president. And as long as the president has a competent food taster, he'll be fine. And actually, you'll love this book because it's just filled with things like that. Now, I would like to ask you now, if you have questions, whether you've read the book or not. Help if you have read the book, but if you haven't, you probably know something about Donald Rumsfeld and his career and what he's done to all of us. And you might want to ask Andrew about that. So please, anyone who would like to go first, at the back.
Timothy Lass, what would you describe as Rumsfeld's redeeming features?
It's a tough one. I just want to, preface that by saying Charlie kept saying, don't think of this as an objective book. I think it's an entirely objective book. I've weighed it all in the balance, and I've come out with, an objective account. There isn't much good to say. It's, I will say genuinely, he's actually quite loyal to friends. Social friends. He'll, if you're a friend of his and you need help, someone told me about their son was going on a school trip and forgot his passport, and he fixed that. It's sort of noblesse sort of thing like that. The mitigation is not so much his redeeming feature, but there is, I suppose I've helped contribute to this, but there is the feeling that, which the military have used as an excuse, and it's all Rummy's fault. If only Rummy had let us use our plan for attacking Iraq and occupying Iraq, then everything would have been fine, and, the Iraqis would love us. Which is patent baloney. It's very self-serving on their part. It is true that Rumsfeld ripped up the military's invasion and occupation plan because he had his own he basically wanted to prove that he was a military genius and that he'd won the war. He thought that the reason they'd won the war in Afghanistan was all because of him, which it wasn't, and he thought the reason they'd won was because he'd said, let's not have very many troops. So the way we'll occupy Iraq successfully is to not have many troops. My conviction is the whole thing was doomed, whatever they did. But the military have used his intervention as their excuse for their own murderous incompetence. So I will plead in his mitigation that it's not all his fault.
Now?
I've got two short questions.
If you could identify yourself.
Yeah, Tim Gopsill. I've got two short questions. Firstly, what's his secret? What's his USP? How is it that he keeps coming back? And the second question is he litigious?
Is he litigious?
Litigious.
I will answer the second question first, which is saying that teams of attorneys have pored over this manuscript, and anything, even whatever sort of callow, yellow-bellied suggestion they've made, I've instantly adopted. So you should be aware of that. What's his secret? The quote, Charlie probably has read it more recent than I have, so he probably has better. There's one of a former colleague of his said Don has a very acute radar, something like this. Don has a very acute radar to detect incoming lethality. In other words, that he's always been very good at sensing threats to him.
He also said Roosevelt knows where to be and where not to be.
Well, that's right. There was another. Yeah, he's very good. He was very good at being in the right place at the right time, and also even better not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that was in particular reference to Watergate, which he missed all of Watergate because he'd made so many enemies in the White House they'd exiled him. But beyond that, first of all, he's very good at detecting threats to his own position. he's a very intimidating character. He's a very, despite me being so derisory about him, he's a very sort of strong character. He's very quick. He has a sense, which actually people tell me George Bush also has, is he can meet you and instantly detect your weakness and play on that. I mean, he does it for fun. I mean, there was like I had lots of stories in the Pentagon. Some poor colonel or one-star general would come in to brief him on something important that he had to know about, and Rumsfeld would spend the whole briefing trying to put this guy off balance. That's what he does. He has other things that have contributed to his success. He's good at making himself, which is part of the intimidation factor. He's good at making himself feared. In fact, which is curious, because actually, although he made himself feared and hated by the military, he didn't actually do much to them. He gave them pots of money and actually fired very few generals. In fact, I could hardly find any. But he has this reputation. Mark Twain said, if a man once gains a reputation as an early riser, he can sleep till lunchtime. And Rumsfeld did that in a big way, particularly, and he projected this air of competence. People kept calling him an efficient manager, although the record of his efficient managing was rather hard to find. I think so. I mean, it's a very important question. I think it's the fear and this full-time concentration, both on self-protection, ducking of responsibility, which he was always very good at, and his whole manner of being. There's lots of subsidiary factors too, like his very crucial political alliance he made early on with the neoconservatives. He wasn't, you can't say he was one himself, but all these ghastly characters like Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, Paul Nitzer himself, and they've turned on him, and they too are blaming him for everything. But that was also crucial to his rise. And also he gave pots of money to the Republican Party. It didn't hurt.
Hi, Lucy Bailey. Hello, Andrew.
Hi, Lucy.
You've said he's not a neocon, but how would you actually characterise his ideological position, and how significant is he sort of intellectually in that?
Well, that's a very good question. I think, so far as I could find any sort of a political philosophy, apart from sort of a traditional Republican one. He grew up. The environment he came out of was this, Midwest. He grew up in the suburb of Winnetka on the Chicago North Shore, which is very, very wealthy, and lots of sort of his early political backers ran huge international, multinational companies. So it was this sort of business internationalist sort of idea. So the notion that he should have become this sort of isolationist away and gone around sort of, gone out of his way to, all his remarks about old Europe and annoying, cutting alliances is kind of curious. He did say there was a curious thing. When he went off as ambassador to NATO, his best friend was the French ambassador to NATO. It was a guy called François de Rose, who actually had this theory and told him that it was very important that America, impose its mastery on the world, and that I don't know this. I don't know what's happened to de Rose, but Roswell would quote him on occasion, saying, "Oh, this wonderful old diplomat, François de Rose, used to tell me that America must make it clear that it will not be pushed around. That you have to," which was, I think, part of his thinking about going for Iraq after 9/11. That we've been attacked, and America must show that it's, cannot be attacked. And just attacking Afghanistan wouldn't be good enough. You have to sort of whack something more significant. And that sounds pretty shallow, but that's, in terms of sort of intellectual depth, again, he's cultivated, he likes to let it be known. He reads tremendous amount, how intellectually curious he is. But again, people who worked with him, and it's like very complicated issues. People would say they'd go in to talk to him about like really complicated sort of budget issues, or to do with new weapons programs, very technologically sophisticated topics. That he showed us a lack of curiosity. He'd say, "Oh, I don't have time for all this stuff. Give me the summary." which again surprised me to hear that. I thought he was interested in that sort of stuff, but no. So it's so I saw no great sign that he'd spent hours poring over the works of Leo Strauss or other sort of neoconservative fountainheads.
He did push the M1 tank and the B1 bomber, but not necessarily for ideological reasons.
Well, again, he likes to. Yeah, he would. For years, in fact, all the way up till last till he left office, when anyone asked him about weapons technology, he would cite the precedent of the M1 tank, which is the current army tank, which he bought. I mean, he decided which tank to buy back in 1976. And it's very characteristic. He will always say, well, that's, the army came in and they wanted this old-fashioned technology, this old, tank with a diesel engine. But I had the vision to see that what we needed was take a technological leap into the future. And I ordered them to buy another tank with the kind of tank with a gas turbine engine, because I knew we had to advance and, develop new technologies. In fact, what happened was there was a competition. There was 2 tanks the army could have bought. One had a diesel engine made by General Motors. One had a gas turbine engine made by Chrysler. The big important factor was that the Chrysler Corporation was going broke, and they had to find a way to save the Chrysler Corporation. So the White House told Rumsfeld, this is in 1976, that he had to buy the Chrysler tank. And the excuse they cobbled up was, well, we need one with a gas turbine engine. So it was this sort of grubby political, maneuver to save this bankrupt corporation, which in his own mind, I think he believes it now, is sort of dressed up into, Don the Visionary. And takes pride in it. I call it his recovered memory. I'm sure if you stuck pins in him or adopted one of the favoured sort of torture techniques he was so fond of propounding, I'm sure he'd still come out with that story.
Yes, right here.
Marianne Stixet. I just wanted to ask you again, what going back to the plan for the war in Iraq, you were saying that he disposed of previous plans and what they went with was, to what extent was that his own brainchild, and to what extent was it the product of something that Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl had been working on throughout the years? And also, what was his relationship with Wolfowitz? Because I remember at the time when they were talking about who to nominate, I was at SAIS at the time, and Wolfowitz was very much under the expectation that he was going to be Secretary of Defense. And so once he was nominated deputy, how was that? How was the interplay between those two?
Uneasy. I mean, I'll answer that part of the question first. It was an uneasy relationship. I mean, they'd known each other for a long time. There was no sign they were ever close. I mean, socially or anything. Rumsfeld, I mean, again, his usual MO, put people off balance, so he would do little things to Wolfowitz, like Rumsfeld would go off to a meeting of the Principals Committee at the White House, which is, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, head of the CIA, Secretary of the Treasury, and the President. It's like the ultimate national security committee. And he'd come back and would refuse to tell Wolfowitz what had happened. So Wolfowitz would be reduced to ringing around the government, trying to find out from his opposite numbers in the other department what had actually their bosses had just decided. And there was no reason to do that. It was just a way of sort of, he just enjoyed pissing off Wolfowitz. He also, there was a rule which no one had taken that seriously before, which was that the Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary, one of them had to be in Washington at all times. So one was away, the other one had to be there. So Wolfowitz would have been planning some sort of big speech to the Chicago Council of Foreign Relations or something, and working on it and sucking his pencil for a day, getting all ready, or to go to Paris or something. And then at the last minute, Rumsfeld would ring up, say, "Sorry, Paul, I've got to go to Baghdad this weekend, so I'm afraid you have to stick around." And he'd have to, Wolfowitz had to sort of tear up the tickets and things like that. That being said, then Wolfowitz, of course, had his own sort of chains of influence. I mean, to Cheney's office. He was very much under the influence of Richard Pearl, who also was an influence on Rumsfeld. It's sort of a complicated thing. I mean, Pearl's one of the few people that Rumsfeld ever seems to defer to in a strange way. Richard Pearl, for those of you who don't know, is this character who's known in Washington, used to be known as the Prince of Darkness, who was a very, very powerful Senate aide, and then was this sort of master bureaucratic intriguer and thoroughly unwholesome character. And and rather influence him. So the plan, Rumsfeld, the people, they all came to the Iraq planning table with different. Pakistanis tell them to knock it off. I can see. So Rumsfeld concludes it's all him, and it's his vision of using light forces on the ground combined with precision bombing that have done the trick. And now we're going to invade Iraq, and we can do the same thing again. And this will be, by the way, this will be one in the eye for those stupid army generals who are telling me that I need 400,000 men to invade and occupy Iraq. So he took great delight in bullying them into scaling back the invasion force, which, in terms of defeating Saddam's military machine, actually you didn't need that many people because it was, contrary to what the administration was saying in its propaganda, it was in a very tatty state indeed. But none of them, the Wolfowitz and Pearl and those people, they had thought about post-war Iraq. They were going to give it to Ahmed Chalabi. Rumsfeld just hadn't thought about it. He'd insisted on getting responsibility for post-war Iraq away from the State Department, which was, defeat his hated rival Colin Powell. Once Bush had agreed to that, he kind of lost interest. He didn't didn't do much planning, didn't really think about it very much. There was no sign of any serious planning, and the results we all know about.
Hello, Ivan Omani. It's often said that one of the more disastrous decisions that was made by the American administration in Iraq was Paul Bremer's edict to de-Baathify society and to send the army home. And I was just reading Bob Woodward's book on this, where he was saying that Rumsfeld again was sort of ducking responsibility, saying, well, Bremer wasn't really my guy. I didn't really have anything to do with him. He was reporting directly to the president. But because these matters were of such great military significance, I found it really hard to believe, and I was just wondering whether that is something that you've come across at all in your research or not.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting, mysterious episode for which no one wants to take the credit, understandably. What's really interesting about it is that on March 10th, 2003, which is 10 days before they attack, they had a big meeting at the White House to go over the plan. And I said they did no post-war plan. There was a little. And in the briefing chart, there was, which was actually, anyway, in the briefing, they said, okay, Iraqi army. We will maintain Iraqi army. We will keep Iraqi army in being and use the Iraqi army for, to hold the place together. It was and this had been, this is one of those sort of very official decisions that had been staffed at every level of the bureaucracy through the Defense Department and everywhere else, and they'd all agreed, signed off, and Rumsfeld included, yes, keep the Iraqi army. So then, they have the war, and then in early May, or the beginning of May, Bremer arrives from Washington with this edict already written, for two edicts. One, abolish the Ba'ath Party, and two, abolish the Iraqi army. It's clear, whoever made that decision, it wasn't Bremer, because he arrived with it. It's clear, it seems clear to me that, it was
one of the people behind it was the people close to Chalabi, i.e. Wolfowitz and Pearl. They were very much behind it because Chalabi hated, I know that Chalabi wanted to get rid of the Iraqi army because that was considered a base of support for his rival, Iyad Alawi. So Alawi was always meant to be strong in the officer corps. So it was in his interest to get rid of the army. Rumsfeld, no way could Rumsfeld let something like this be done. He would have daily video conferences with the commanders in Iraq, and he was always, he paid attention. I mean, for his own reasons of his own self-protection, I think. The idea that this happened without Rumsfeld sort of noticing, which is what he told Woodward, is completely ludicrous. He signed off, and I think he didn't really think through what the consequences of this were. And because the State Department was against it, that was another good reason to be for it. But I think the inspiration for this disastrous decision came from the Pearls and the Wolfowitzes.
Doreen Walton, was there a specific incident that made you decide to write this book?
Not really. It was sort of feeling that there was this guy. I was, thinking about Rumsfeld, reading about him in the paper or something. I was thinking, well, we don't really know much about this man. We know what he's told us. Like this legend of him sort of dashing out to help the wounded on 9/11, and things already. I got the idea back in February last year, and where things were, had clearly been going wrong for a long time, but now were really clearly going wrong. And how come things, why is this guy such a disaster? And then quite early on when I was talking to people, I met somebody had been a very senior White House sort of national security fellow, and I said, official, and I said, well, how powerful is Rumsfeld really? Is he really in this administration? Is he really that powerful? And the guy said, looked at me like I was mad, and he said, you're kidding. He says he controls half the discretionary spending of the United States government, and he has a total veto on all foreign policies. How powerful is that? So that sort of convinced me I was on the right lines, that this is a chap worth writing about.
Sorry, David Sibright, well, the mic's here. I see someone called Lady Morgan is blaming Rumsfeld and saying Bush and Blair and everybody else is innocent. Is there not danger that everybody's going to blame Rumsfeld and the other culprits will get away with it?
There is. I mean, that's what I tried to say early on in mitigation. The military, they all deserve the blame. I mean, he, as a prime architect, deserves probably more of it.
There's enough blame to go around.
Enough blame to go around. But like the military, I quote in the book, there's a story about when the so-called revolt of the generals last April, when all these former retired generals started issuing statements saying what a terrible disaster Rumsfeld was and calling for his resignation. One of the generals who signed on to that was a guy called Chuck Swannock, who had been the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, which early on in the occupation had been based in Anbar province, west of Baghdad, and in Fallujah, among other places. And Swannock, in his denunciatory letter, said Rumsfeld has been responsible for the terrible decisions and the scandal of Abu Ghraib. Well, the 82nd Airborne, while Swannock was commanding it at that period, one of their bases outside Fallujah was a base called Camp Mercury, which was a fortress in the desert. In the middle of the camp was an area, a ring of razor wire, in the middle of which was something called the Puck tent, P-U-C, which was their word for persons under confinement, which were prisoners, which were basically Iraqi civilians, males, who they'd rounded up, in fact, more or less at random, and stuck in this area. It was a tent. It was called the Puck tent. Ordinary soldiers in the rest of the base were encouraged, if they were feeling depressed, pissed off, bad letter from the girlfriend, to take a baseball bat or whatever and go along and beat up the prisoners as a way of softening them up for military interrogation. So for the military, this General Swannock, who used to swagger around with a shotgun to show what a sort of martial type he was, for him to be blaming Rumsfeld for Abu Ghraib, I thought was a bit unconscionable, considering what had gone on. There was other things that went on in the 82nd Airborne and in other parts of
occupation as well. So that's there is a possibility, yeah, that if it wasn't for Rummy, Iraq would be like Switzerland. But I think it was guard against that. Yeah.
Hi, Ed Harriman. It's really interesting to me that you and indeed many other journalists have not yet been able to find out about that decision to disband the Ba'ath Party and to send home the army. I think that's extraordinary that this administration has been able to keep that secret for so long, given that people are prepared to talk about all sorts of other things. My question is this. I'm very interested in the sort of personal dynamics of cabinet government, whether it's Reagan or the older Bush or the younger Bush, and each president has its own style, of course. And access to the president's ear and to how the president thinks and makes decisions is obviously very important. I don't want to prejudice my question, but it seems to me that Condoleezza Rice has, by and large, had a pretty free ride from the media for a number of reasons for quite a long time. She obviously plays an extremely important role, certainly with the president. And I've read very, very little about Rumsfeld's relationship with her, and I just wonder whether you can cast some light on that.
Yeah, it is curious in that, she and Bush seem to have this close relationship. Actually, if you read the National Enquirer, which is I regard as the journal of record, it's actually very close. The Enquirer has been very good for some reason. The rest of the mainstream media is dodging this one at the moment. But on the other hand, everything I've heard, and who's to say I could be completely misinformed, that you get the impression that really for the big guys, Rumsfeld and Cheney, everyone else is just the help. And particularly, I'll give you an example of the way they treated, Rumsfeld would treat the national security, would treat Rice. He, normally, there's a military staff on the NSC, and Rice was meant to be informed about everything the Pentagon was doing. That's her job to know, in the first term when she was National Security Advisor. But Rumsfeld wouldn't tell them. He would refuse to let any information about Pentagon planning be routinely transmitted to the National Security Council. So you had the ludicrous situation where on the National Security Council, the senior director for military affairs, a guy called Frank Miller, who was a sort of crafty old bureaucrat who used to be in charge of all nuclear targeting, in a way rather sinister figure, but he organized a sort of an operation where his staff would basically hack into the Pentagon computers. And then there's a thing of the Pentagon that has its own internet, the SIPRNet it's called, which is called the secret internet. So you had the situation where officials or people working on the National Security Council for Rice were having to break into the SIPRNet. Getting access to sort of sites they weren't meant to be looking at, to find out things like when Rumsfeld proposed to mobilize the reserves, which is kind of an important thing for the White House to know. What units he proposed to send to Iraq, what was happening in Iraq, what the commanders in Iraq were transmitting back. This was how Rumsfeld treated Rice. This because Rumsfeld had this contempt for Rice and wouldn't tell her things. Frequently, early on in the war, Rice, when the president wasn't there, Rice would preside over principal committees or meetings of the National Security Council. But they had to stop taking votes. Normally you'd have a vote on a decision, but they had to stop taking votes because often enough there'd be a vote and the majority would be aye, Rumsfeld would vote no, and the noes would have it, which was rather embarrassing for Rice. So her solution was to stop holding votes. So I say it's odd, although it's an interesting question, although Rice is meant to be very close to Bush, and spends a lot of time sort of socially with the family, Rumsfeld at least, treated her with contempt and, seemed to pay no attention to what she said or did. So I think if we're looking for the author of this infamous decision, it probably wasn't Rice.
Hi, Lucia Greenway-Sco. I'm a student at SOAS. And I have a question about his initial appointment and the conditions for that. It seems like if Rumsfeld is such a bumbling idiot in all the things that you've said about him, what do you think appealed to him from Bush's point of view and also from the Republican establishment behind him? And I'm an American citizen, and he is the architect of so much of our foreign policy and has endured a lot. I mean, one of his biggest failures, which you haven't mentioned, I don't think, or not explicitly, was his underfunding of the troops and that famous moment when in the media conference, I think it was in Kuwait, when one of the troops said, we have scrap metal on our trucks or whatever, and we have to use this junk because we don't have enough money to keep us safe. And he survived that, and he survived the de-escalating of the popularity of the war, and then only left office after the elections, the midterm elections. And so why does he stay in power? I mean, what is it about him that is appealing from the Republican point of view? Is it his hawkishness, or does this reveal some sort of disconnect between the civilian leadership in the Pentagon and the military leadership in the Pentagon that's really problematic? Or something?
Well, yeah. So a bumbling idiot. I've given you enough sort of reasons to think of him as a bumbling idiot, but he's not really a bumbling idiot. Doesn't quite express it. I mean, he's a very powerful personality. He's very. You don't want to sort of mix it with him. As I said, he senses a weakness. He's very aggressive. He's competent at defending himself. He's always been very ruthless in using the press. I mean, he as I think I said earlier, he's very good at making himself feared. He did other things. I mean, I think that also. Why did he survive for so long? First of all, he had this relationship with the president, and so Bush always backed him. Remember that for a long time, we are used to thinking that the Iraq War was a disaster. It was a disaster from the beginning. It got more disaster as time went on. In political terms, it went on being successful. I mean, they won the 2004 election. I mean, the national security threat, the war on terror, worked for them for a long time. And Rumsfeld was very much an expression of that, which dated from 9/11. Other things he did, I think, which are also quite important. The defense budget, has gone to unimaginable heights under his stewardship, which meant a lot of people were making a lot of money. I looked up, just out of interest, to see what had happened to the index of defense stocks while he was in charge. And it had gone up 100%. So if you were in defense stocks in the Rumsfeld years, you did very well. There was, that certainly made him popular in important Republican circles. He was making people a lot of money. And it wasn't until really his position, I think he would have remained as secretary if he hadn't, if they'd won the midterm elections last year. The fact that he'd become such an issue and they then lost meant that, then he had to go because he was the reason they'd lost. He could be cited as the reason they'd lost. So actually, to his own shock and surprise, he didn't expect to be fired. When he was summoned to the White House and Bush said, well, it's time to make a change, Don, or whatever it was, he said, this came as a nasty shock to Rumsfeld, I'm told. Showing that his sense of incoming lethality had let him down at last. But I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer. How come this incredible turkey lasted so long? But he did.
Hi, Fiona Anderson from the BBC College of Journalism. I'd just like to comment on how nicely you are situated in front of a photograph that I think Rumsfeld would have found highly appropriate.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. My question is it something that's preoccupying the British media at the moment? What role do you think as I'm interested in the personal dynamics, as is Ed Harriman here, what role do you think Rumsfeld played in persuading British politicians to line up with the Americans in the war? For example, have you found transcripts of discussions between Rumsfeld and his British counterpart, Jeff Hoon? I would be very amused to hear what was said between the two of them.
I haven't. I am told he didn't like Hoon very much. He thought he was kind of a twit. He liked, what was he called? Robertson, who went on to NATO. He liked him a lot. Didn't like Hoon. For whatever reason, I don't know. I mean, maybe Hoon's just likable fellow. I don't know. But, I mean, Roosevelt, remember just before the war, he said, he said, we don't really need the British military. Remember? He said, he was with his usual deft touch for diplomacy. And Blair had to scramble to get them to say, Britain is frightfully important to the coalition. But Roosevelt just said he was rather contemptuous of the British of the British contribution. I think he certainly probably intimidated Blair and the others. I mean, my understanding from talking to sort of British diplomats in the embassy in Washington, how incredibly impressed and excited people like Blair were to go to the White House, to go to Camp David. It was like, it's always amazing to me. I mean, still, Britain is not totally insignificant. I mean, I don't know why they felt so sort of flattered and craven to be invited to sort of eat at top table, but they did. And Blair particularly, I mean, Blair could be impressed by Silvio Berlusconi, so... So to be actually spoken to nicely by Don Rumsfeld may have been a big thrill. I don't know, that's the best I can do.
This came out very well in David Hare's play, Stuff Happens.
Right.
Blair is portrayed very much as a Bush courtier.
Yeah.
Any little compliment that came his way was thrilling.
Wagging his tail like fury, yeah.
And there was a wonderful statement where the George Bush character says, when Blair is about to arrive, Rummy says, Blair's coming. And Bush says, it's too bad. He said, why? He said, Dick doesn't like him. Doesn't like Blair.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Socialist.
No, sorry, I said I would take a question here, and then sorry.
David Stewart, this is a bit trite, but heck, it's Friday night. Do your researchers and your conversations suggest that the president actually does have enough sandwiches to make a full picnic, or not?
Well, it's easy to say, no, he's completely dumb and stupid. On the other hand, he's president. There's something... People say that he has a good instinct, I mean, from his own point of view, for politics. That he does, know, he has had, I mean, now he's at 28% in the polls, so he's not doing so good now, but, for a time he had some smarts that would enable him to be successful in his chosen profession. That being said, I've no other, we have few other indications that he's much in touch. I mean, the story, which sounds bizarrely unlikely, except I absolutely believe my source, which was last summer, Bush Jr. goes up to stay, he and Laura go up to stay at Kennebunkport at the Bush mansion in Maine, and Bush, the two Bushes, father and son, are 41 and 43, as they call, are out for a walk, and 43 says, "Can I ask you a question?" And 41 says, "What?" And he says, "What's a neocon?" And Bush 41 rises to the occasion and says, "Do you want names or a description?" And 43 says, "I'll take a description." And 41 says, "I'll give it to you in one word, Israel." And that was it. So, if it took him till 2006 to be even wonder who these people who, he doesn't read the papers. He sort of brags about not reading the papers. He says he likes to get unvarnished opinions from his aides, which is... So, what can we say?
Suzanne Mooney. I just wondered, back in the days when Rumsfeld and Saddam Hussein were quite friendly with each other, and chemical weapons were sold, what was his relationship with Saddam Hussein like at the time, and how did he justify selling chemicals to Iraq? And now, how would he look back on it, and can he justify it to himself, or would he be the sort of person that could admit to making mistakes?
I mean, answering in reverse order, no.
He doesn't admit to making mistakes. Looking back on it, he really wishes they hadn't taken that photograph. They didn't actually sell. They didn't actually sell chemical weapons. I mean, they did. They gave the a range lens and agricultural credit. I mean, they made it possible for Saddam and made sure no one interfered with Saddam getting chemical weapons. I mean, it's rather touching. Saddam, when Rumsfeld was sent off to be special Middle East envoy in 1983, and no one in the Middle East could stand him, or almost no one. The American ambassador in Damascus, whenever Rumsfeld was coming through, and those sort of people would stay with the ambassador. The ambassador would, a guy called Paganelli, he would always make it a point of he'd leave town. If finally he's going to leave town, but only after locking up the liquor cabinet. But there was one area where they did like him, which was Iraq, and the Iraqi, Saddam and his people. They said they thought. Tariq Aziz told someone that they thought that Rumsfeld was a genuinely nice person and a good listener, which is facets that seem to have escaped everyone else. So somehow Rumsfeld got on well with.
But Tariq Aziz, in your book, he did refuse to pass on a certain letter from Rumsfeld.
Well, right, that's right. Rumsfeld. So they did. Rumsfeld got on very well with Saddam. If you read them in the official cables on the meetings, they show how well they just agreed on everything. They were just got on like houses on fire. That's one episode Charlie's talking about was Rumsfeld made 2 trips to Baghdad in December 83 and then again the following March. The second trip, on his way to Baghdad, he stopped off in Israel, where Yitzhak Shamir, who was then foreign minister, gave him a letter for Saddam, containing an offer from Israel to supply arms to Iraq. You should remember that Israel was at that point Iran's principal weapons supplier in the war, so they would, could double the business by selling arms to both sides. So Rumsfeld says fine, tucks the letter in his pocket, and then when they get to Baghdad and he meets Tariq Aziz, he says, I've got this letter for you, for the boss from Yitzhak Shamir, Israeli foreign minister, offering to help you. And Tariq Aziz reared back and said, even to touch the letter would earn me instant execution from the boss. But rather, this is not, the thought that the Iraqis might not be too thrilled to be buying weapons from. On the previous trip, Rumsfeld spent a lot of his time with Saddam trying to sell him on the idea of a pipeline, building up an oil pipeline for the Bechtel, to be built by the Bechtel Corporation, which would run to the Jordanian port of Aqaba, but we should also have a spur running to Israel. And Rumsfeld hadn't thought that maybe Saddam Hussein wouldn't be too interested in the idea of selling oil to Israel. But he didn't get very far with that. Despite their budding friendship, he didn't get very far with that.
He did manage to pave the way for Bell and Hughes helicopters to be sold to Saddam.
Oh, yeah, business was great. I mean, they all want you to forget this now, but everyone got on that bandwagon. Richard Nixon, his staff, he was in exile in San Clemente, and his staff set up a company to sell military supplies to Iraq. And they got a big contract to supply uniforms to the Iraqi army, which they had made in Romania. And there is a letter extant from Richard Nixon to Ceausescu, saying he said he wanted to pass on, thanked Ceausescu in his help in facilitating this contract, and to say that he had been assured by the Iraqi authorities that the workmanship on these uniforms was of the highest standard. So everyone was getting a piece of the action, and why should Don be left behind?
Good question here.
Brian Eno, you said that he was very wealthy. How did he make his money? And what drugs does he take? Do you know? I assume he does. Most people in Washington do.
I certainly didn't plumb that one. He likes a scotch. I mean, he likes to drink. But he made his money when he left. He grew up. His father managed a real estate office in this wealthy suburb, where, among other people, he met at school, because there's a very famous high school there called Nutria High School, where the rich, it's a public school, but the local rich folks send their children there. And among the people he met there were the Searle family, who owned a company called G.D. Searle, which is a pharmaceutical company.
And in 1977, when he stopped being Secretary of Defense, when the Ford administration left office, the Searles hired him to run the company because the company was going under. Principally because these had been run rather incompetently, but more importantly because the FDA had formed the unworthy suspicion they were faking their drug tests. And the only thing that could save the company really was a product they developed called aspartame, which was an artificial sweetener, which they knew would be a big winner. But the only problem was the FDA was being sniffy about it because some scientists were alleging that it had the nasty side effect of giving rats brain cancer, and were refusing to release it until this issue was resolved. So Rumsfeld, although the legend he built for himself was he turned the company round, he slashed unprofitable divisions, he trimmed the headquarters staff, cut the fat, built up the lean, and did all those good business things. In fact, all he did was get aspartame approved, which he only was able to do when Reagan came into office, and he used his political connections. That's why I would say, the way to think about Rumsfeld is as a courtier, and he's very good at court politics. So he used his court connections with the new regime to, first of all, get the commissioner of the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, Food and Drug Administration. The first thing they did, practically, Rumsfeld, Reagan had hardly checked into the White House, where he issued an executive order firing the FDA commissioner, who was told to leave his office immediately. And they had another one whose previous mark in history is he'd run mind-controlled experiments on unwitting army recruits some years before. Anyway, he did his duty and approved aspartame for release. And it was a huge success. And they sold the company. Rumsfeld himself walked away with $10 or $12 million. And that was the foundation of his fortune.
Carolyn Cerf. I'm wondering if you or if Rumsfeld himself is at all concerned that he might bear some criminal liability in international law for what he's done, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, many people had that idea in a very optimistic way, and the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, in association with some former Iraqi detainees, brought us in Germany, as you probably know, has one of these universal jurisdiction laws or legislation. They brought a case in Berlin to get a German federal prosecutor to institute a case against Rumsfeld on torture, specifically on various discrete instances of torture. But sad to say, the German prosecutor has declined to take the case. So now there's the thought they might try the Spaniards, and try and go it's the Pinochet route, but to get the Spaniards to do what they did with Pinochet. There was another effort to bring a case in a U.S. court, which got thrown out in his ear immediately. At the moment, the prospects don't look too likely that he'll be held criminally liable, but you never know.
Again. I'm not sure that the question on Saddam Hussein was completely answered. What does Rumsfeld say about the volte-face over Iraq, or hasn't anyone asked him?
Not really.
Can I just follow on to that? Have you yourself interviewed him?
No, he turned me down. I can't think why, but he did. He does. What they said was, at the time, we had to. It's realpolitik. We had to, at the time, they said, we were defending against Iran. There was the threat of Iran taking on the Middle East, and we had to sort of prop up Iraq, with the support of the Arab world, or else they'll say, it was a plague on both their houses. You're right. They've never been properly cross-questioned on it. There was a period after the first Gulf War when there was a lot of interest in this, and it became clear how much the U.S. had cooperated in arming Saddam, but that went away. A lot of documents disappeared. So Rumsfeld itself, he's never been. Let's see, what has he said about it? When he's asked about, yes, he has been asked about it, and what he likes to talk about is the fact that when he was introduced to Saddam, he said, how he outsmarted Saddam, because Saddam, when he was introduced to people, would keep his hand sort of low down, so whoever was shaking his hand would have to bend down to shake it. But Rumsfeld has made a point of saying, I kept my hand straight out, so Saddam didn't, his trick didn't work, so I got the better of him. It's sort of, crap like that. But in terms of the thoughtful answer I think you're looking for, I couldn't find it.
I think we're coming nearly to the end. One more question, then I want to ask a question as well at the end, but please. Do you need a mic?
I just wonder what you feel about Michael Meach's opinion that perhaps some of Rumsfeld and his crew had an inkling that maybe the Twin Towers were going to be bombed before they were.
Well, I mean, they were endlessly warned that that something was up, that that Osama bin Laden was contemplating an attack in the United States, and in fact, aircraft hijacking was on the agenda. There was Rumsfeld. I mean, George Tenet was always rushing over to the White House saying, "We've got another warning," and he gave one of those sort of briefings to Rice in the middle of July. I think it's July 17th, sometime around then, 2001, and Woodward said that she paid no attention. I'm told that's not true, that actually she did take it seriously. This is another indication of Rice's relative standing in the White House, actually, in the administration. And she arranged for Rumsfeld and Ashcroft, the Attorney General, to get the same briefing. It seems to have had some effect on Ashcroft, at least, because he stopped taking commercial airliners immediately the next day. Rumsfeld apparently poo-pooed it, said, the CIA was just falling victim to massive doses of Al-Qaeda disinformation. And this was, they were being completely gullible. He didn't believe a word of it. So an inkling, they had good reason to have an inkling, but they don't seem to have paid much attention. I don't subscribe to the very, unfortunately, I think very widespread belief, certainly in the US, that it was all a massive conspiracy and that Rumsfeld and Bush and everything, were that the Twin Towers were rigged with demolition charges and were deliberately demolished in order to provide the excuse on war on terror. I think that's sort of demented conspiracy mongering with no validity whatsoever, and it's actually been very bad. I think it's distracted a lot of people from the sort of real politics of the war, of the situation, and that's why the anti-war lobby hasn't been as effective as it might have been because of this mad conspiracy thinking. I mean, there's enough. We know enough of what they really did do. We know what they did, without having to sort of construct, what I think is a sort of fantasy about, blowing up the Twin Towers and things like that.
Thanks very much. One question I want to ask you. Do you remember an organization called Indict? And
yeah.
Indict was pressing for many years before the American invasion of Iraq for the criminal indictment of Saddam Hussein and his henchmen for war crimes and genocide.
That's right.
And most countries in the world signed up to this, and they wanted to create a special tribunal at The Hague for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. But only one country steadfastly opposed it, the United States. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why the United States government would oppose such a thing.
Apart from a sort of deep-rooted aversion to any kind of international law, which was probably, I don't know the full answer, but I think that's probably the reason. I mean, it's like Colin Powell, when he was Secretary of State, and might have been doing things like not, speaking out against this, the Iraq invasion. They spent a lot of time trotting around the world getting, Equatorial Guinea and Albania to commit in writing not to sign on for the International Criminal Court. And such was their fear and loathing of any concept of international law or jurisdiction. So that's the only answer I can think of to that.
So I want to thank you very much for coming. I want to thank all of you for coming here. Andrew, wait. Andrew will be signing copies of his book, which are being sold here tonight. Everyone's expected to buy at least 2. One for himself, one for a friend. And afterwards, come and have drinks downstairs. If any of you are not members would like to be members, get membership forms. And the club has set up a fund now called the Fixers Fund for translators, drivers, and other helpers of journalists in the Third World who get killed in the line of duty and whose families are very rarely, if ever, compensated by the networks and major news organizations who employ them. And so on the website you'll find out how you can make donations to that rather worthy cause. And again, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew, and I hope you'll all buy the book. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry.